In the summer of 1863, while cannon fire echoed across Gettysburg and the Union plotted its path to victory, something darker, far older, unfolded in the soft black earth of Middle Tennessee. Beneath the manicured lawns of Rosewood Manor, the Chamberlain family built more than a cotton empire. They built a tomb, a silent, calculated graveyard of 63 lives, and that's only what survived the burn ledgers. You see, the Chamberlains weren't like the other Southern elites. They didn't just exploit the enslaved. They didn't just profit off the war. They transcended the rules entirely. While other plantations collapsed under the weight of labor shortages and blockades, Rosewood thrived, almost unnaturally. More cotton, more exports, more gold. No matter which side won the battle, Ezekiel Chamberlain got paid. But how? It wasn't just brilliant economics. It was blood, ritual, silence. Federal investigators, long after the war, whispered of disappearances. 73 workers gone without a trace over 18 months. These weren't slaves. They were freedmen, white laborers, whole families who vanished after signing contracts with the Chamberlains. But no arrests were made, no trials, only sealed reports buried deep in Washington archives until a nameless clerk leaked one fragment in 1983, a single yellowed memorandum stamped, "Do not circulate. Executive eyes only." It mentioned 3 words: human chemical disposal. That was the crack, the leak, the echo of screams long buried under Tennessee soil. And once you hear what really happened behind the whitewashed walls of Rosewood, you'll never see history the same way again. This isn't about one greedy family. This is about how power sustains itself, not with truth, but with erasure. And now, as you sit comfortably in your home, ask yourself one thing. What if the very fabric of your nation was built not just on slavery, but on a precise science of disappearance? A system so perfect, there were no bodies, no blood, no trace, only cotton, and gold, and silence. This is your final warning. Once you know what lies beneath Rosewood, you don't go back. You ever ask yourself how a man gets that kind of wealth during the worst war this country has ever seen? It wasn't luck. It wasn't talent. It was selection, ruthlessness, the willingness to cross a line no one else dared touch. Ezekiel Chamberlain didn't inherit just land. He inherited an ideology, a cold-blooded blueprint passed from father to son, written not in ink, but in silence, in obedience, and in the manipulation of trust. While other plantation owners cried about emancipation and fled south with their silver, Ezekiel stayed, smiling, hosting generals from both armies like a man holding 2 knives behind his back. He signed contracts with Confederate quartermasters during the day, then sold the same cotton to Union agents at night. Same bales, double the profit. It was fraud on a national scale, but that wasn't the real secret. That was just misdirection, a polished lie for those too lazy to look deeper. The real business? That was underground. Beneath the second barn, beneath the fields, beneath the orchard that never bloomed right after 63. Where most saw a cotton plantation, the Chamberlains had created a machine, a self-contained system of human extraction, hidden inside the polite rituals of Southern aristocracy. Laborers signed contracts they didn't understand. Freedmen promised wages that never came. They weren't whipped. They weren't punished. They were disappeared, perfectly, quietly, one by one. And here's what makes it worse. The community knew something was off. Neighbors whispered. They saw the same faces one week and new ones the next. They noticed how the same boots kept showing up in the fields, same hats, same names recycled. The whispers reached the sheriff. They reached the reverend. And yet no one acted. Because silence protects power. Because fear, real fear, isn't loud. It's passive. It's civilized. It's what keeps a man from asking too many questions when the ledger books stop matching the head counts. And Rosewood's ledgers, they never matched. But by the time anyone had the courage to speak, they were gone too, folded into the chemical vats under the barn, filed away under disciplinary removal in Margaret Chamberlain's copperplate script. You want to know how dynasties are built? They're not built with money. They're built with bones. They called it Rosewood Manor, like something out of a romantic novel. But that name, it was camouflage. You see, when people hear plantation, they imagine fields, families, maybe cruelty, but at least cruelty they understand. They don't imagine surgical tables beneath the hayloft. They don't imagine journals full of measurements, not of cotton yields, but femur lengths, blood volumes, chemical reactions per body type. Because what the Chamberlains built was more than a plantation. It was a laboratory of control, a prototype. And it started with a single lie. In October of 1862, Ezekiel Chamberlain sent a letter to the Union Army offering to employ both freedmen and destitute whites for fair wages during wartime. The offer was hailed in Nashville as progressive, even noble. The War Department approved it. They even provided security for his shipments. But what those government agents didn't know, or pretended not to know, is that no wages were ever paid. Every worker was locked into a contract with a clause, no compensation until the end of service, and none ever completed it, not a single one. Now think about that. 63 contracts, 63 disappearances, 0 payouts. And when families asked questions, they were met with forged testimonies. Drunk, violent, theft, every time. It was a pattern, and Ezekiel knew patterns. He didn't just understand economics, he understood belief, how people cling to stories that comfort them, how communities will accept silence over scandal, how the right signature on the right page can bury the loudest scream. But the brilliance, the true horror, was how he structured the operation. You had Margaret managing supplies with machine precision, inventorying flour, wax, soap, and lime in coded ledgers. You had Daniel and Samuel, one a chemist, the other a butcher in everything but name. And you had 2 strangers, pale men with surgeons' hands, who were never recorded in any census. They weren't locals. They were brought in, hired, and their expertise wasn't in farming. It was in erasure. One would mix the solution. The other would stir. What they left behind was filtered, catalogued, and melted into gold. Jewelry stripped, bones dissolved, names rewritten as absconded. And Rosewood Manor continued to bloom. From the ashes of vanished men came pure cotton, pure profit, and a silence that paid dividends. And yet, the story doesn't end there. No. This was just the prototype. By spring of 1863, the Chamberlains had perfected the process. Not of cotton, not of agriculture, of removal. Every worker who arrived at Rosewood was greeted the same way. A warm meal, a firm handshake, and a contract printed on thick ivory paper. Wages, generous, terms, fair, on the surface. But buried beneath the legal language was the clause. No early termination, no partial compensation. Breach of contract equals forfeiture of goods. Goods, not wages. And that one word, goods, told the entire story. Because once you signed, you weren't a person anymore. You were an asset. A line in Daniel Chamberlain's ledger, a body whose contents could be converted to gold if properly processed. But there was a problem. Even monsters like the Chamberlains needed help. They needed someone to keep the operation moving in daylight, someone respected, trusted, just enough outside the inner circle to be useful and expendable. That man was Josiah Creek. A veteran overseer, loyal, weathered, built like the barns he managed, sturdy and silent. He had worked for Ezekiel's father. He had punished slaves, broken uprisings, enforced quotas, but what Rosewood had become chilled even him. At first he thought he was losing count. The numbers didn't match. Food stores lasted too long, blankets stayed folded, tools sat unused. The official record said 67 workers. He saw 39, and then the dream started. Strange lights in the woods, lanterns swaying through the quarters at 2 a.m., whispers, creaking doors, names being called, not shouted, but murmured, as if the forest itself was trying to remember. So he started watching, counting, tracking, and what he saw broke him. It began the night Daniel and Samuel entered a cabin carrying nothing, and left 20 minutes later hauling a heavy canvas sack. The shape, the way it moved, Creek knew. He'd seen hog carcasses cars had weighed the same way. But this wasn't a slaughterhouse. This was supposed to be a plantation. And still, no cries, no struggle, just silence. That's when Creek made his first mistake. He followed, and what he saw that night would never leave him. 3 men, 1 father, 2 sons, and the strangers. Pouring clear liquid onto a body as Ezekiel whispered numbers into the night like a prayer, a ritual. Not an execution, a sacrifice. There's a moment in every man's life when reality fractures. For Josiah Creek, it was the glint of bone beneath torchlight. As he crouched behind a tangle of brush, watching the Chamberlains pour quicklime into a shallow grave, something inside him snapped, not out of fear, not even guilt, but out of clarity. He finally saw the truth, not just of Rosewood, but of everything. It had never been about race. Not really. It was about utility. And once you became more valuable dead than alive, your fate was sealed. That's the math of empire. The following morning, Creek did something dangerous. He approached Samuel Chamberlain directly, asked about the missing field hand, Benjamin Carver. Samuel didn't flinch, just smiled. "Some folks break contracts," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "We break the man." No denial, no fear. Because men like Samuel don't answer to the law, they are the law in places like this. And so, Creek stopped asking questions, out loud anyway. But in the shadows he moved, he documented, he followed the schedules, watched the pale strangers come and go from the converted barn. He saw the vats, the furnaces, the ledger, that damned ledger. That's when he understood. This wasn't improvised. It was engineered. From the moment a worker arrived, their timeline was mapped, down to the week, sometimes the day, when their body would be converted. Every signature marked the countdown, every possession catalogued before death. Even the graves, 63 of them, were pre-dug. Think about that. You don't dig 63 graves unless you know you'll fill them. And still, no one talked, no one intervened, because every man who got close vanished. Like Martha Henley, drowned without struggle. Like Isaac Freeman and his family, erased without a trace. You want to know how evil survives? It doesn't hide. It parades itself through marble columns, polished silverware, handwritten hymns on Sunday morning. It smiles while the foundation it stands on is still warm with the dead. And as the weeks passed, Josiah Creek stopped sleeping, not from fear of death, but fear that he was becoming like them. He started counting people like cattle, started calculating how many bodies equaled a ton of cotton. And that's when he realized the scariest part of all. The Chamberlains weren't insane. They were efficient. You've been taught to believe evil wears horns, that it rages, drools, shouts, and leaves blood in the streets. But the truth, evil wears gloves, white gloves. It writes in calligraphy. It hosts tea parties under magnolia trees. And in 1863 it lived at Rosewood Manor, wrapped in French silk and mahogany polish. Margaret Chamberlain, matriarch, mother, mistress of the estate, was the operating system behind it all. Historians paint her as a Southern belle hardened by war, but Creek knew better. He watched her oversee inventories not just of flour or candles, but of wedding rings. Yes, wedding rings, laid out in rows, polished, sorted by carat. Do you understand the psychology? This wasn't a woman tolerating evil. She managed it, refined it. She didn't flinch when she passed the barn. She didn't look away when workers vanished. She adjusted the household budget to account for their replacements. She wasn't scared of what was happening beneath the floorboards, because it was her system. And here's the thing they never tell you in textbooks. The deeper the evil, the more polite the people become. The Chamberlains hosted dinner parties as men dissolved in acid beneath their feet. They served wine as bones broke in silence. They said grace, while their sons turned flesh into gold. Rosewood Manor was a theatre, and everyone played their part. Sheriff Briggs tried to raise concerns, briefly, but when he showed up to investigate Thomas Henley's disappearance, he was greeted with a prepared ledger, signed testimonies, and a glass of imported brandy. He left with a pat on the back and a whisper in his ear. "Some truths aren't meant to be stirred, Sheriff." A week later, he stopped asking questions. Because this wasn't just a family secret. It was a regional contract. The war gave cover. The government looked away. Cotton was needed. Gold was won, and no one asked where the workers went as long as the shipments kept coming. The Chamberlains became legend, model citizens, pillars of community, and the barn remained locked, always locked, until one night it wasn't. And what Creek saw behind those doors would mark the end of who he was, and the beginning of something far more dangerous. Not rebellion, not revenge, but awakening. The lock on the barn was simple. A rusted latch, a hook, not the kind of security you use to guard tools or livestock. But Josiah Creek knew that wasn't what they were guarding. That night, with the manor asleep and the moon hidden behind a shroud of clouds, he slipped inside. The air struck him first. Not the stench of rot. That would have been almost comforting. No, this was chemical, metallic, like bleach, but worse, like something that didn't just clean, but erased. The room was lit by a single oil lamp. Its glow flickered across the walls, and what they revealed didn't look like a barn. It looked like a facility. 4 vats lined the far wall, large enough to hold entire bodies. The surface of the liquid inside was still, but thick, pale grey. In one, he saw something float. A shape. Half submerged. Human. But no longer a person. Just residue. Near the vats were work tables. On them, piles of personal effects. A boot, a wedding band, a broken locket. Creek recognized each item, and suddenly, every story made sense. Thomas Henley hadn't run. Eleanor Walsh hadn't changed her mind. The Freemans hadn't disappeared. They had been processed. And then, he saw the furnace. It glowed in the corner, fed by coal and operated with surgical precision. A crucible sat beside it, half full of molten gold. In a wooden tray nearby, unmarked ingots stamped with no crest, ready for trade, clean, liquidated. But that wasn't the worst of it. No. The worst was the desk. The ledgers, open, detailed, cold. Names lined each page, written in Daniel Chamberlain's neat script. Not just names, metrics, weight, age, value of possessions, decomposition time, lime usage, profit margins, human lives reduced to formulas. Thomas Henley, $47. James Patterson, $89. Freeman family, $156. And at the bottom of each page, written in a smaller hand, confirmed, rendered. That was the word they used instead of murdered. Rendered. Like fat into soap, like bone into ash. And in that moment, Creek felt something leave him, some final piece of loyalty, some final thread of obedience to the world he thought he understood. Because this wasn't just crime. This wasn't just cruelty. This was design. A perfect machine of silence, wealth, and vanishing. And it was working. Josiah Creek left the barn that night a changed man, but in Rosewood, changed men don't last long. He tried to act normal, kept his face flat, his voice steady, his hands busy, but inside his mind was racing. Because when you know the truth, the real truth, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending that wealth is earned, that power is clean, that your masters are anything but well-dressed beasts. And worst of all, they saw the change in him. Margaret first. At breakfast the next day, she asked how he slept, her tone sweet, casual, but her eyes calculating. "Still dreaming, Josiah?" she asked, cutting into her pear with a silver knife. "Best keep your feet on the ground." A warning. He nodded, smiled, chewed the inside of his cheek to keep from screaming. Later in the fields, Daniel approached, placed a hand on Creek's shoulder, squeezed, not hard, just long enough. "Need you to check the north fence," he said. But there was no break in the north fence, and Creek knew. He was being watched. The Chamberlains were experts in pattern recognition. They knew how a body moved when it was scared, when it was planning, when it was contaminated by truth. So he did what survivors do. He started writing. Late at night, in a crawl space beneath the smokehouse, he hid scraps of parchment, dipped his pen in boiled berries, and chronicled everything. Names, dates, weights, methods, not just what they did, but how they got away with it. The sheriff's silence, the governor's letter, the bank record showing gold deposits under fake merchant names, the refugee resettlement forms forged with army stamps. It was all there. His plan was simple: finish the ledger, escape the manor, get to the Union lines, and tell the world. But simple plans don't survive in places like Rosewood. Because one night, as he was returning to his crawl space, he forgot and the entryway, disturbed. The dirt was shifted, the boards lifted, and the pages gone. In their place, one sheet remained. Blank. Except for 4 words written in blood-red ink: "We saw you watching." In that moment, Creek realized the truth. The Chamberlains didn't need chains to control people. They needed secrets. And now, he had become one. From that night on, Josiah Creek lived in 2 worlds, the one where he walked and talked and obeyed, and the other, the real one, where every breath felt borrowed, and every shadow whispered his name. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat much. He worked harder than ever, not to prove loyalty, but to delay detection. Because once they know you know, your life becomes a countdown. They didn't kill him right away. No, that would be too easy. Instead, they isolated him. Workers stopped speaking to him. Tasks were reassigned. He was sent to repair fences that didn't need fixing, asked to count tools that had already been counted. He saw fewer faces each day, fewer eyes, and the silence grew louder. Until one morning, he woke to find a noose hanging in his quarters. Freshly tied, still swaying. No note, no name, just the message: "You're next." He didn't run, because he understood something most men never do. They don't need to chase you when they already own the ground you stand on, and that's the power of systemic evil. It doesn't shoot you in the street. It removes you from memory. No grave, no trial, just absence. That was the Chamberlain way. Creek's thoughts turned to escape, but where? Every road was watched, every neighbor complicit. Even the Union patrols were paid off to overlook certain irregularities in exchange for stable cotton shipments. But then came the child. Her name was Mary Beth, 11 years old, daughter of a cook, half feral, smart as a whip, silent as death. She appeared at his door one night, barefoot, eyes wide. "They're gonna take you soon," she whispered. "I heard 'em say. Mama says you should go. She hid something for you, in the old well house." Then she was gone. Creek didn't ask how she knew. He didn't ask why she risked it. He just moved, slipped out under the cover of rain, made his way to the well house, and there, beneath a rotting bucket, he found a bundle wrapped in canvas, a map, food, a revolver, and a second ledger. His ledger. Copied, preserved. Someone had read it, someone had believed, and someone wanted the world to know. But there was blood on the bundle, fresh, still wet. The cost of truth, paid again and again. It was never going to be clean. No escape from a place like Rosewood comes without a toll. Josiah Creek knew that. But he also knew this: he wouldn't die silent. He packed the ledger, the map, and the pistol, left the food behind, too bulky. Time was now more valuable than nourishment. The rain kept falling, thick and punishing, turning the roads to sludge. Good. It would mask his tracks, delay the bloodhounds. The well house was already behind him when the first shot rang out. It wasn't a warning. It was protocol. Creek dropped low, rolled into the tree line, and moved. South first, then west, toward the edge of the Chamberlain holdings, toward the train line that cut through county soil like a scar. He had less than an hour before they closed the net. He thought of Mary Beth's voice, the blood on the bundle, the way the manor seemed to inhale every time someone disappeared, and he ran harder, but the land itself betrayed him. Swampy earth sucked at his boots, brambles tore at his coat. At one point he stumbled into a ditch filled with stagnant water, the ledger nearly slipping from his grip. But he held on, because that wasn't paper anymore. It was proof, and proof in an empire of secrets is more dangerous than any gun. He reached the crossroads by dawn. A narrow dirt path where the trees broke and the fog thickened. There, hidden behind a fallen oak, was the train line. If he could reach it, he could ride east, toward Chattanooga, toward witnesses. But someone was already there. A figure, tall, still, in a grey coat. Daniel Chamberlain. No pistol, no posse, just standing, waiting. As if he'd known this would be the route, as if he'd counted on it. "Josiah," he said, voice calm, almost paternal. "You've done something brave. I'll grant you that." He took a step forward. Creek raised the pistol. Daniel didn't flinch. "You think that a ledger will save you?" he asked. "The people you'll show it to. You think they're outside this?" Another step. Creek's hand trembled. "You think anyone builds a dynasty without blood? We just stopped pretending ours came from war." He smiled. "You're not escaping. You're just switching overseers." Creek pulled the trigger. The shot echoed. Daniel dropped. Not dead, but bleeding. The train whistle sounded in the distance. No time for ceremony. Creek ran, not just from Rosewood, but towards something far darker. Chattanooga. To most men, it meant safety, civilization, Union control. To Josiah Creek, it meant the next arena. He arrived caked in mud, boots split, hand trembling from exhaustion. The pistol was empty, the ledger hidden inside his coat, sealed in oilskin. But his eyes burned with something terrifying, purpose. He didn't go to a preacher, not to a newspaper. He went straight to the provost marshal, the Union authority. A man named Colonel Abram Wexler, stern, northern, well-pressed uniform. He listened as Creek poured it all out. The barn, the vats, the ledgers, the disappearance of laborers, the melting of bodies into unmarked gold, the complicity of Rosewood's neighbors, the fake merchant accounts. And then, Creek handed over the ledger. Wexler took it, didn't open it, didn't even look at Creek. He buzzed his aide. "Take this man to the holding barracks, get him cleaned, fed." For a moment Creek felt relief, but the moment passed. Because he wasn't taken to a bunk, he was taken to a cell. Not locked, not official, just watched. Every hour. Men in uniform, not Confederate but Union, passed by, pretending not to see him. No meals came, no visitors, just silence. And then, on the third day, Wexler returned, ledger in hand. He sat across from Creek, placed the book between them, and opened it. "Do you know how many people want the war to end?" he asked. "How many millions depend on cotton exports resuming?" Creek said nothing. Wexler flipped the pages. "Gold traced to the Chamberlains. Yes, we can verify that. But let me ask you something. Who do you think owns that gold now?" Silence. "Do you think it sits in a Chamberlain vault?" "No, Mr. Creek. It sits in ours. The Union, the banks, the industries rebuilding the North." Another page turn. "Do you think the people funding this war don't know how the sausage is made?" "Of course they do. But, Hey, also know what happens when you pull the curtain back too far. Wexler closed the book. You want justice? I get it. He slid the ledger into a drawer. But justice in this country doesn't move by truth. It moves by strategy. And with that, the interview was over. The next morning, Creek's cell was empty. No record of his arrival. No mention in the logs. Just a note, later discovered by a janitor. If the devil wears grey in the south, he wears blue up here. Josiah Creek vanished. No court records, no grave, no discharge, no mention in the military logs, just gone. Like so many others who'd touched the nerve of something too big to bleed. But the story didn't die with him. Because Creek had done what the Chamberlains never expected. He planted the truth in multiple places. That second ledger, the one copied by Mary Beth's mother. It wasn't the only copy. Creek, in the days before his flight, had etched entire sections into thin birch bark and tucked them into broken fence posts. He had whispered names to travelers, scribbled codes into hymnals, carved initials into pews at the Rosewood Church, seeds of testimony scattered like ashes. One of those seeds found its way to a man named Elijah Thorne, a preacher, a drunk, a war deserter. But above all, a man whose father vanished in Rosewood in 1859. Elijah found the bark, read the names, saw his father listed. Moses Thorne, $64, rendered. He didn't weep. He woke up. He began preaching again, but not salvation, not heaven, truth. Underground meetings sprang up across Tennessee, then Georgia, then the Carolinas. Quiet gatherings where stories were cross-checked, names aligned, timelines reconstructed. Farmhands, midwives, former slaves, freedmen, soldiers, they came together, piecing together the full horror. The Chamberlain ledger became legend, a cursed book, a map of industrial slaughter wrapped in Christian plantation etiquette. People whispered of bodies turned to oil, gold stamped from bones, men who vanished because they saw too much and dared to speak. And soon copies began to appear, handwritten, incomplete, full of errors, but alive. They passed from hand to hand, sewn into coat linings, hidden in flour sacks, stashed behind church altars. You couldn't tell which versions were real. That was the beauty of it. Even if they caught you, I never knew if they'd caught the right one. The Chamberlains tried to stamp it out. So did the Union brass. But by then, it wasn't a story anymore. It was a movement. And in that movement, Josiah Creek became something far more dangerous than a witness. He became a ghost. Not one they could bury, but one they'd never stop chasing. They say empires don't collapse from invasion. They collapse from infection. By 1871, the Chamberlain name still rang with power. Their cotton operations had expanded post-war, now employing freed labor under contracts that looked like freedom but smelled like slavery. They diversified, railroads, timber, banking. But something had begun to fester. The blacklist. At first it was just a whisper, certain investors refusing to back tainted families. But soon it became a pattern. The first Tennessee bank pulled out of a Chamberlain mill deal in 1872. Then a northern insurance firm refused to underwrite their cargo ships. Why? Because somewhere in Boston, a young clerk had read a copy of the ledger. The Chamberlains hired Pinkertons to track down the source. They found nothing. Because by then, dozens of copies had circulated, hand-copied, rewritten, altered, some filled with exaggerations, others pure fiction. But it didn't matter anymore. The taint was there. Investors grew nervous. Journalists began digging, quietly at first, then louder. By 1874, an anonymous editorial appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. There are families in the South whose fortunes rest not on the sweat of laborers, but the liquefied marrow of vanished men. No names, no specifics, but everyone knew. The Chamberlains responded with lawsuits, libel, defamation, conspiracy. But each suit brought more attention, and the more they fought, the more people remembered the whispers. Then came the deaths. Jacob Chamberlain, eldest son, shot himself in the chest in New York after a business merger collapsed at the last minute. Margaret Chamberlain, the Iron Matriarch, died of what the coroner called unexplained internal hemorrhaging after receiving a package that reportedly contained a fragment of the original ledger. Daniel Chamberlain, the enforcer, the hunter, disappeared in 1875 while traveling through Kentucky, last seen boarding a train, never disembarked, seat found empty, blood on the window. Even Rosewood itself began to empty. By 1880, the cotton mill had burned twice. The manor stood vacant. Locals swore it moaned in the wind. Visitors vanished. Children were warned, don't go near the grounds. The soil remembers. And the family line? By the turn of the century, the Chamberlain name had been scrubbed from half the records it once owned, not by enemies, but by descendants, desperate to sever the bloodline. Because once the truth is loose, it doesn't matter if it's provable, it just has to feel possible. And the Chamberlains? They felt like guilt in silken bones. You ever wonder why you never learned about Rosewood? Why the Chamberlain dynasty doesn't show up in your textbooks? Why the Civil War is framed in noble terms, strategy, sacrifice, liberty, but never industry built from liquefied men? There's a reason. Because by the early 1900s, a new threat had risen, not just from those telling the truth, but from those who believed it. You see, a myth, once it begins to feel real, becomes dangerous. So what did they do? They did what empires always do when the truth gets too close. They bought silence. Academic grants were offered to historians, so long as they focused on verifiable military events. Donations poured into southern universities, with stipulations. Certain archives were closed. Certain letters misfiled. Plantation records conveniently lost in fires. The Library of Congress received a sealed crate in 1911 marked Rosewood Financials Unprocessed. It's still unprocessed today. You can request access. You'll be denied. The crate is real. It exists. But no one's allowed to open it. And if you ask too many times, you'll be told the paperwork was incomplete, that the archive is being evaluated, that context is essential before making any material available to the public. Context. That's the new weapon. And meanwhile, Rosewood sits there on the map, barely a ghost. The manor? Demolished in 1923 after a mysterious fire. The land? Bought by a holding company called Cranefold Bishop, which through a chain of shell firms, now belongs to an energy conglomerate that happens to fund several very patriotic museums. Coincidence? Not when you trace the ownership and find a man named William D. Chamberlain III on the board. They still walk among us. Not with whips and chains, but with stock options and influence. They don't need to melt bodies anymore, because they own the systems that make sure no one remembers the ones they already did. Josiah Creek. Officially, he never existed. The war records list no man of that name stationed in Rosewood, no union payroll documents, no prison log. But if you visit a certain church in northern Georgia, in a graveyard tucked behind ivy-choked ruins, you'll find a stone. No dates, no epitaph, just one word. Witness. There comes a moment in every man's life where he has to ask, what have I been standing on? You walk across cities, drive down highways, visit banks, museums, government buildings. You go to school, say your pledges, trust the names on the plaques, Chamberlain Hall, Wexler Auditorium, Bishop Library. You assume they earned it. But what if it wasn't built on genius or sacrifice? What if it was built on 63 graves? Not metaphorical. Real. Bones rendered into gold. Screams dissolved into oil. History edited like a spreadsheet, line by line, name by name, until all that's left is a clean page and a clean conscience. You don't remember Josiah Creek because they don't want you to. You don't learn about Rosewood because the institutions telling you what matters own the silence. But here's what they didn't plan for. The internet, the scans, the fragments surfacing from forgotten trunks, flea markets, basement boxes marked Grandpa's papers. They thought time would erase it. Instead, time amplified it. Now, in back rooms of archive forums, deep threads of history TikTok, encrypted PDFs circulate. A page here, a name there, not enough to convict, but enough to awaken. And that's where you come in. Because if you're still watching, still listening, then you've already been marked. Not by the Chamberlains, but by the truth. You can't go back now. You've seen the rot under the floorboards. The line from Rosewood's vats to modern wealth portfolios, the names scrubbed from ledgers, now etched into foundations of banks, trusts, scholarships. You now know the truth wasn't just hidden, it was monetized, weaponized, cleansed in suits and stock shares. So what do? You speak. You trace the names. You ask questions when you're told that's inappropriate. You visit that grave. You whisper Josiah Creek into places where silence has lived too low. Dare. Because you are not just inheriting their wealth, you're inheriting their ghosts, and they're not resting, because justice never sleeps, it just waits for someone willing to bleed truth louder than money. So ask yourself, how much of your world was built from vanished voices, and what will you do now?